All right, welcome again to everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Welcome back to, I think this is our sixth or maybe even seventh episode of our Behind BrainPark interview series we're doing, where I'm virtually sitting down with our BrainPark staff, students, as well as the researchers that use the facility to kind of find out a little bit more about their background and the kind of the research they're doing with BrainPark. So today, Olivia is sitting down with me virtually. Welcome, Olivia.
Thanks, James.
Looks like you've got a nice setup, plenty of indoor plants there behind you.
We do, yeah. This is my shared office space, and we just tried to make it as welcoming and interesting as possible, as we're spending majority of our time here these days.
Yeah, it's recorded during stage 4. Olivia is one of BrainPark's clinical PhD students, who's got a pretty super cool project using virtual reality exposure therapy and OCD, as well as looking at kind of the clinical implementation of that. So, but before we get into that, Olivia, tell us a little bit about, I guess, your background and how you got into science / a clinical PhD.
So I was always a kid who really enjoyed science, but in terms of getting into psychology, I remember being in high school and they'd organised some person to present about the Myers-Briggs type indicators. And that kind of got me hooked. It was kind of like a socially acceptable horoscope where you get to know more about yourself. So that was sort of like my entry point into the world of psych, and started thinking about it more seriously. And then I remember around that time, there was also a book by Norman Doidge called The Brain That Changes Itself. And my dad gave that to me, and as I was reading it, it just introduced this whole new world about neuroscience and the brain, and it was just this new frontier that got me really excited. So that sort of informed my choices going into university. Did a double degree at Monash, art science. Psych was one of my majors, and then also did my honours there, and that was in sleep psychology. And around that time, Fitbits were a big thing as well. And so everyone in the sleep lab was wearing these wearables and tracking their sleep data. And I was really getting into that. And so that intersection of science and technology and psychology and mental health, and being able to have commercial devices, that was all sort of really exciting for me. So I took a bit of time off after I finished my honours. And in that time, I had a friend who was really a big enthusiast in gaming, and he had actually an early Kickstarter kit for Oculus. And I hadn't really heard anything about that previously, but he kind of put that on my head, and I was just introduced to this really immersive world. You couldn't do too much at that time. You were mostly just sitting around and moving, but it was pretty impressive. But I didn't think much of it, apart from just a sort of gaming application. And then come a couple of years later, when I was starting to look at postgrad courses and projects, I came across BrainPark and found out that they were actually doing research applying virtual reality for things like OCD and gambling. And I was like, wow, this is happening. I really want to be a part of this. And so I organised to have a chat with Mira and Beck, and that's sort of how we got the ball rolling, really. Yeah,
awesome. So I guess with that's a kind of a great background into what your project is. So you're working with VR and doing VR exposure therapy, and working out of the Melbourne clinic in Richmond in Melbourne. Now, if anyone wants to, I guess, find out a little bit more about the development of the virtual environment which you're using for your project, you can listen to the interview that I did with Alison. I'll provide a link in the description below, or find that on our channel. But do you just want to give the viewers just a brief background on what the virtual environment is that you're using?
Yeah, absolutely. So these environments that we developed initially with Taurus, actually before that it was Sensi Labs, but we then collaborated with Taurus Games to do further refinement. These were developed with OCD contamination concerns in mind. So a form of OCD that sort of has obsessions or intrusive thoughts that are around fear of being contaminated by germs. And they might be quite specific, or they might be sort of general germs. And that brings up this fear of or anxiety and discomfort. And oftentimes people will engage in compulsive behaviors, such as hand washing or cleaning. That's sort of a bit excessive and a bit beyond what sort of the average person might respond to. And so it actually interferes quite a lot with their day-to-day lives. And so one of the main treatments for that is cognitive behavioral therapy. And the technique is exposure and response prevention. So essentially that involves people being exposed to the things that trigger or sort of bring up that anxiety, and also not engage in that compulsive hand washing that they normally would. And so by doing that, you sort of start to learn to tolerate those uncomfortable feelings, and start to be able to tolerate that without having to do the hand washing. But that can be quite a difficult, it's a really confronting process. And so usually, it's quite graded before you get to doing it in real life, and upping it into the more distressing sorts of situations. So VR is a really good sort of medium or bridge to that work, because immersive VR environments today that we have, it tricks your body and your mind into thinking that it is really real, but it's quite a safe environment still. And so it's a good training ground. So we actually have environments, we have a kitchen and a public bathroom scene where people can go in and interact with different objects, and we can also increase the level of contamination in both of those rooms. So from completely clean to really, really gross, like beyond what most people would ever encounter, really. And just have that flexibility. Yeah.
I've been in the environments, and I can attest they're pretty disgusting at their higher levels.
Yeah. And I guess you have the added benefit of being able to have the clinician actually there with you to guide you and support you through that experience. Oftentimes in an office setting where you see a clinician, or in a virtual setting nowadays via telehealth, you might not be able to be there whilst they're practicing it. So that's really handy.
Yeah. And as I said, if any of the viewers want to find out a little bit more about the research that went into, I guess, validating those environments, you can kind of catch the interview I did with Alison. But I guess, do you want to talk to me, tell me a little bit more about then, I guess, your project focusing on, I guess, the view of clinicians and how they what they think about VR as a form of therapy, as well as, I guess, the clinical utility of it being used in exposure therapy. I guess any technology at the moment and how we can adapt, I guess, the traditional ways that we do therapy is only more present in the current situations we find ourselves in. So do you want to tell me, I guess, what your kind of project is focusing on?
Yeah, sure. So I guess broadly my project has sort of two arms. So the first I was talking about was that clinical application. And as James was saying, we're partnering up with the Melbourne Clinic, and we're trying to see whether can be an effective way to be used in relapse prevention. So sort of help people stay well for longer after they've actually engaged in active treatment. But the other arm is actually implementing or bringing this technology into clinical settings, because I guess historically we have been quite slow to adopt new technologies. But as we've seen with COVID, when we're kind of forced to, we can adapt. But there are barriers to that initially. And this is just one of those things where we don't really want to squander that opportunity that VR has. There's been over 2 decades of research that kind of backs VR's efficacy in treating anxiety disorders. And back then, the major barrier was technological barriers. So this tech used to be so expensive, like ridiculously expensive, really big and clumsy, really hard to use. But since about 2016, we've got like the Oculus, HTC, all these really commercially available and affordable options now. That tech is now viable. But I think that one of the major barriers now will be just the awareness of this technology, and also the awareness of clinical environments that are available that are scientifically validated as well. There are vendors there actually offering licensing for these, but not a lot of uptake at the moment still. So that's one of the other arms is really trying to understand what are the kinds of factors that might be getting in the way of clinicians and services taking up this technology, and also are there any factors that might enhance or facilitate its uptake. So once we can kind of document all of that, try to actually come up with a bit of a strategy to help people be aware and address these challenges.
Yeah, awesome.
Second,
So where are you at with your PhD?
So I am currently about halfway through the third year of what's a 3.5-year degree. So I'm sort of edging into the pointy end of things. Yeah.
Yeah, nice one. And how has your, I guess, your clinical training, how has that kind of been affected the last few months when we find ourselves in our working from home situation?
Yeah, there's been a lot of change. I think every aspect of society has really had to adapt, and a lot of things are moving online, and that's also been the same here. Unfortunately, my first placement in the beginning of the year, we had to suspend just when things were starting to come into place. There's a lot of uncertainty. In terms of my current placement, I am mostly doing that all through virtual means as well. So we're doing all our meetings virtually, and any client contact is also through telehealth as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thanks for sitting down with me today. Obviously, the research you're doing is kind of only getting more and more relevant as we find ourselves in situations where we're looking for new technologies and new ways that we can deliver the same kind of treatments for mental health. And virtual reality is kind of a key player in that field. So thanks for sitting down with me today.
No worries.
One last question, as I ask all of my interviewees: why would someone do a clinical PhD at BrainPark or with the BrainPark group, seeing as your PhD is actually based out of the Melbourne clinic?
Yeah, cool. I guess I'm probably obliged to say that the facilities are amazing. We have a purpose-built VR room, which I'm so gutted that I don't get to use actually. But beyond that, and there's also like a big brain. It's kind of like our chandelier, but it does actually have the purposes of being able to visualize brain changes if people do scans as well. So that's pretty cool. But I think that aside, I think it's the lab, and I know that a lot of other people have been bringing up the people, but it is that it's the brains trust. I think we have a really diverse group of people who are really passionate about mental health, and you know, when we have lab meetings, there's always something new. There's always different comments and feedback, and it's just it's a really great learning environment. I think you're always inspired. So yeah.
These are the common themes that are coming out when I question. But thanks again for sitting down with me. Good luck with your clinical placements that are happening virtually, as well as your research that also happens virtually. Hope you have a great rest of the year, and it'll be cool to sit down with you again next year sometime. I guess maybe post data collection for your project, and have another chat about kind of like where the data has led us in terms of implementation of VR for exposure therapy.
Yeah, absolutely. Can't wait for then.
Thanks, Olivia.